Good day everyone, this is Regine, and along with Ms. Chanko, we are tasked to report the literal translation. So let's start with understanding the literal translation, but before that, let me provide you first our abstract. So the abstract of this report is that it focuses on true translation approaches, and the first one is the literal translation, in which it is really our topic, and the second one is the free translation. We'll just present just short information in regards with the free translation, because it would help us to understand more literal translation when we're gonna differentiate it with the free translation. So it will discuss some of the issues raised by the debate between researchers about whether literal translation or free translation should be the primary approach to translation. It will also analyze the notion of literalism and distinguishes between the main types of literalisms, which are the etymological, semantic, lexical, and grammatical, by illustrating examples. So let's proceed. So translation is necessary for the spreading of new information, knowledge, and ideas across the world. It is absolutely necessary to achieve effective communication between different cultures. In the process of spreading new information, translation is something that can change history. So due to the fact that there are a lot of approaches of translation, this report will elucidate on why there is an opponent on supporter of literal translation. So yes, of course, translation really helps us in communicating with other people, especially to those people who actually had different language from us. So for example, we are Filipinos, and we do have some friends from America, Australia, and we're speaking in English. But the good thing is that we know how to speak English. So yeah, let's not take it as an example. So an example is, maybe you have a Korean friend. So the best thing about translation is that it would help us to understand our friend, our Korean friend, by just having a translator or being processing translation, because we cannot understand that particular language, so translation would be our tool in order for us to understand them. So that is the importance of translation, and we're gonna be delve deeper more on regards with the literal translation, because there are kinds of translation, and right now we're gonna be focusing on the literal translation. And we're gonna be discussing, of course, short information about the free translation. So what is literal translation? So literal translation is a translation that follows closely the form of the source of language. It is also known as word for word translation. So for example, it is actually really word for word, because that specific word, you find equivalent word for that in order for you to translate that word. So the best example for that is we Filipinos. If you've had relatives that is working abroad, or an OFW, so they were actually most probably encountered people who has different languages, and in order for them to understand them, of course they're gonna be using translation. And actually, the funny thing about it is that Filipinos are really fond of doing word for word translation. So for example, I've actually had a relative, and she's actually an OFW, and he just or she rather she's actually a fan of doing word for word translation. For example, she told me that instead of so I'm gonna be saying it in a Filipino language. So what she means is that ikaw or you, ikaw, bakit hindi ka nagpunta doon? So she translated it into English. So this is how she say it. You, why you not go there? So instead of why you didn't go there, you, why you not go there? So she's actually just basically doing word for word translation. Maybe that is understandable, but the construction of words is not really grammatical. So the right word or the right sentence for that is why you didn't go there instead of why you not go there. So that is how literal translation works. So Newmark agrees that this technique is the best option for translating text where the from where the form is as important as the content, such as great speeches, autobiographies, literary works. So there are two approaches of translation. So what I've mentioned earlier, that we're gonna be inserting some kind or some information of retranslation in order for us to fully understand literal translation. So literal translation is the rendering of a text from the language to another one word at a time without considering the meaning of the text as a whole. So yet it is actually not considering the meaning at all. So just like the example that I provided, just like the one of my relative that just translating the Tagalog words into English word for word. So she didn't for as long as she is understandable, she didn't mind if it's grammatical or not, for as long as she was being understood by the people she's having conversation with. So it involves word for word translation, and there's no additions or deletions from the original text. So yes, for example, earlier, as what I mentioned, that they've actually just translated it word for word, no additional, no deletion of original text. So that is how literal translation works. And for the free translation is actually a counterpart, or yeah, a counterpart of literal translation, because in literal translation, word translation, there are no addition or deletion, but in free translation, there is actually deletions that happens in order to keep the flow of language fluent and natural. So in free translation, it focuses more on the meaning, on the grammar. So this is more actually adequate than the literal translation. Free translation is translating of a text in such a way that it reproduces the general meaning of the original text without considering word-to-word meaning. So that is the difference between free translation and literal translation. So there are actually opponents and supporters of literal translation. So for the opponents, Ordudari 2007 said that literal translation is such a translation in which the source of language, grammatical constructions are converted to their nearest translation language equivalents, but the lexical words are again translated singly out of the context. So another one here is Cicero believed that literalicism is a sign of translator's weakness, his language poverty, because yes, most of the people who uses literal translations are actually those people who are actually having English as a second language, and not all, but there are really actually people who are having a hard time translating some words, especially Philippine. I'm not generalizing, but some people really, especially Filipinos, are actually having a hard time translating Filipino words to English very adequately rather, and they're really having a hard time translating that. That's why instead of translating it into a very grammatical way, they've just translated it word for word, for as long as they know that the translation or the English word of that particular Filipino word. So that is actually the weakness of the literalism, so language poverty. And yes, and for the next one is Blake. According to Blake 2003, sometimes words cannot be literally translated from one language to another, owing to a lack of clear correspondence between the words of the two languages. So yes, that is correct, because actually there are really not all of words has an equivalent correspondence or has an equivalent word. For example, we do have here Filipino words that don't have an equivalent to English words, so we cannot directly translate that particular word. So that's why if you're going to translate some words on Google Translation, you may find there that there are actually words, not all words has an English translation. So that's why we need to be careful in translating words, especially Filipino words, into English words, because not all words has an English or direct translation. And maybe if we're gonna translate that word, it may come out ambiguous or ungrammatical. And for the supporters of literal translation, via Zimsky, Fett, and Braille Sub were also among those who supported the idea that translation should be a copy of the original. Yes, they supported it because that is actually from the word translation, translating one particular word to another language, one particular language to another language, Filipino language to English language. So that is, they supported it because from the word translation itself, translating one particular word to another, but the same and original word. And that is why they supported literal translation as an approach for translation. And the translator attempts to preserve the very forms, comprehending, of course, the lines of the language that has at hand by Rutgauss, 1996. And according to the Nabokov supporter as well, 1990, literal translation means rendering as closely as the associative and syntactical capacities of another language allow the exact contextual meaning of the original. So it's actually just entails the same with what Vyazemsky, Fitt, and Ryusov says, and why they supported the literal translation. And yes, here are actually the examples of the literal translation. So yes, I'm not saying that literal translation are really inadequate, but there are really times that if you're going to translate a certain word for word, there are going to be a times that it would fall as ambiguous because, as what I mentioned earlier, no, not all words has an equivalent, not equivalent English word. So, for example, this sleep carefully, so it really falls as ambiguous, and people may misunderstood this. So that is actually the disadvantage of literal translation. Though literal translation is good for those people who's having a hard time expressing themselves, especially those having a hard time speaking in English, most specifically. So this is actually a good this is actually the best kind of approach of translation for them, because they would just find the equivalence of that particular word in order for them to express what they wanted to say. But in regards really with the grammar, with the adequate or the grammar or the right construction of words, this is really where literal translation would go wrong, because sometimes it would really construct inadequately, especially it will fall as ambiguous and maybe other people would misunderstood that. So that is all about literal translation. So I hope you have learned something from my report. And if you do have questions, just don't hesitate to ask, and we'll be more than willing to answer all of the questions that you have today. So thank you so much for listening. Again, this is Regine, and thank you so much once again, and God bless us all.